everybody. It's really great to be here. Eyeo has just been amazingly inspiring so far, and I've just been really excited to be here and to see all the presentations and to just have this amazing group as my peers. It's been really inspiring. So this talk, Blinky Lights, it was actually originally in a much sillier font, but this computer doesn't have as much silliness available, I guess. And so this talk, I kind of wanted to be able to, when I usually put together a talk, I kind of have this this goal, I want to be able to say, here's this thing that you should, that I've done that I can have some data for, and it's really cool. But in this talk, actually, it's a bit more of a story. It's kind of a set of things that happened to me, kind of some places I've been, and this weird place I ended up that seems to involve a lot of LEDs for some reason. And I think it's kind of a neat place because it kind of occupies this interesting kind of overlap between fields, and I think it has some potential to inspire people and to maybe help educate people in ways that avoid some pitfalls of the past where we would kind of subconsciously would nudge kids into the direction we think they wanted to go in instead of actually giving them the opportunity to find directions on their own. So yeah, a lot of this is going to be starting with some of my old work. So this is sort of an artist's concept of what my life was like for a long time, drawn by a former coworker of mine. And so I've been actually making things my whole life. I started out when I was 6 years old. And it's actually kind of a common story you hear in sort of computer science departments, people who get started early. And people have a lot of different reasons for this and reasons to continue or not continue. In my case, it was sort of an addiction. It was sort of an escape. It was something I did because I didn't really have any friends. My childhood was really strange and pretty lonely, and there were a lot of problems I was trying to run away from. So tech was actually kind of this interesting thing that became a world I could escape into. It was sort of this completely parallel universe where people didn't really, exist to kind of be problems in my life, where a lot of my personal problems didn't exist, and I had this capacity to kind of construct anything I wanted. And so it started out as this escape, but then it kind of became this addiction, this thing that I would, do very alone and very much in isolation from the rest of the world. Tech just kind of became its own end. There wasn't really anything else because that was the thing that I was holding on to. That was my addiction, and everything else fit into that framework. So that took me on kind of a strange path, and it led me to this place that's sort of in between worlds. I ended up with all of these skills from this tech world that I grew up in, but then I didn't really like where that ended up. And especially lately, life has brought me to San Francisco, and San Francisco is sort of this really great example of what happens when you just bring a bunch of people who are really excited about tech into the same place, and you get people making just all sorts of things, all sorts of really amazing creative things, and then a bunch of things that I just don't really understand how anybody could like because it's really just all about the tech, and so I didn't really see a culture there that worked for me. And I never really felt comfortable, calling myself an artist because, as other people have mentioned here, even that's kind of bred out of people in school. I tried drawing and I was told that I did it wrong, so it wasn't really something that I felt like I had access to. Whereas technology was something that I could learn on my own, and I never really felt, there was nobody there to tell me I was doing it wrong, so I could just kind of have free reign over it. So I got here through a lot of good luck and a lot of bad luck that just kind of averaged out to something, and maybe that's how people discover new places. But once you've discovered it, it's interesting looking for other paths to get there. And so I've been thinking about how to bring other people to this place kind of between art and technology, and wondering what we can change about our process and our education and just how we speak to kids. So speaking of kids, my early childhood, this Forrest M. Mims III, he was my childhood hero. I remember getting just 2 books when I was 5 or 6 years old that completely changed my childhood. One of them was the manual for a particular flavor of BASIC that my dad used a lot in his work. And I just devoured that. But the other, and the one that kind of I feel is so much more of an inspiration to me, is Forrest M. Mims III. And he's still around. He's doing science writing, and he appears in Make magazine with little puzzlers and brain teasers. And he wrote about electronics in a way that made sense to me, because it wasn't just about electronics. It was about kind of curiosity about the natural world. It was about visual analogies, which would then become a theme, all throughout my life. I've always dealt with things with visual analogies. And he did this for things like electronics and, building things and dealing with signals. So this was hugely inspirational to me. So with that, I went on to make things like this monstrosity, which occupied most of my high school life and some of my college. The idea behind this, so that I called this the Kiwi because I needed something short that made a good Subversion repository name, and it was my answer actually to a real problem I had, which was sort of a weird problem that maybe only I had, where I thought that it was really great to have like laptops in school for taking notes, because I thought it kind of worked with the way my mind worked. I could organize things in a way that made sense to me. But the way I did this was by finding like broken laptops on eBay and like buying them for less than the cost of shipping and fixing them up. And that wasn't really accessible to most people, so I wanted to make something, this turned into something a little bit more like the One Laptop Per Child project, but if like a high school student imagined it and then worked in the basement for years trying to build one out of like Radio Shack parts. So it was a sort of homebrew computer made of like this ghastly wire contraption and a Motorola 68K, and it had a bootloader and it ran Linux. And this was my education. I tried. I went to school. My parents thought it was a good idea for me to go to college and study computer science. But this is always how I've learned things. It's always been this combination of sort of visual analogy and hands-on experience, and porting Linux to a weird thing you made out of wires. This also turned into a gateway to this other project that occupied a really large portion of my childhood. And this turned into kind of an addiction, too. So with this Kiwi project, I'd built this hardware. I wanted this sort of like children's laptop, but it was this really weird contraption that had like a keyboard and a really low-res screen and no touch screen. And so, none of the existing graphical environments were anywhere close to it. And, we would discover, of course, that, touch interfaces, everybody would have to redesign this stuff eventually. But I started doing this in like 2000, thinking about like what interfaces could scale across very different devices. You could run them on like kiosks and desktop computers and laptops and handhelds. And I had some really weird ideas. A lot of them were really bad. It turned into a really big learning experience where I got to kind of dive in and discover all those layers of software and how they worked. But it was also this kind of form of escape. Like, I don't think I would have ever gotten to that level of understanding if I wasn't using this as a way to avoid other interactions in life and, avoid, dealing with things. So it was an interesting kind of like substitution, kind of a case study in what happens to like a human if you substitute like a normal human education and childhood for like stuff like this. And so what happens? And so I didn't have a lot of the community locally. My parents like living out in the middle of nowhere, and so I didn't really have a lot of people close by. But I started building online communities, and actually this image on the right is an IRC client where I was hanging out with other developers on this GUI thing that I created like in high school, running on an old Mac that I had ported Linux and this weird GUI environment to. So it was a strange, extremely roundabout way of having a social connection with people. And so time progressed. I got really excited by projects that straddled this border between hardware and software. And I think some of it might have been the kind of visual learning style that I was missing out on a lot in kind of more traditional software work. But a lot of it was tactile. I really like the way things feel. I think I have some degree of synesthesia where, I really appreciate the connection between physical forms and ideas and shapes and sounds. And so it was just extremely satisfying to do projects that just let me work with my hands. And so I would do things like this. This was a project where I wanted to kind of like run my own software on the Nintendo DS and kind of really get into that platform. And of course, the video game companies in the name of security make that very hard. And so this involved getting in between the processor and the RAM and using some FPGA hardware to kind of like grab all of that data as it went by. But it was also an excuse to do really intricate work under a microscope with X-Acto knives, which I had a lot of fun with. And this was kind of an early place where I found that boundary between art and technology, in video games, because it did kind of try to push the technology in ways that I thought were interesting, kind of leading to all of the kind of ingenious stuff you'd see in early consoles and the demo scene. But it was also, so it had that kind of high-tech aspect, but it was also very much art. It was about storytelling. And so I think I found myself drawn to that early on, but without as much background in sort of the human side of that, I didn't really appreciate the storytelling side. It was just more of a kind of an impulse. Like I saw that and I wanted it, but I didn't really know why yet. So I found myself drawn to kind of the high technology side of it. This was also a good example of this thing that I discovered where I would consistently build my own tools. I would always find myself doing things that weren't really quite possible with the existing tools, but I knew that they were possible, so I would have to invest in the tools first. And so things like this were just a really big investment. But then, due to another kind of malfunction of the way I approached these projects, a lot of the time I would build the tool and get so addicted to the tool itself that I wouldn't be able to step back into the project I was working on. So of course, I never actually built like a homebrew system for the Nintendo DS. I just built really good reverse engineering tools for it. But I really liked reverse engineering. Like reverse engineering is something that, I've never done it professionally really. I've done bits and pieces of it in various jobs. But reverse engineering to me is kind of like the tech equivalent of like art criticism, kind of looking at something that just involves like this outpouring of creativity and effort and seeing, all these brushstrokes and little pieces on the canvas, and then just trying to think, what motivated the artist to do that? Why were they in that frame of mind when they painted that brushstroke? And then trying to take that extrapolation of consciousness and then kind of bring it back to, what's the rest of their work look like? And I saw this in software, but it frustrated me that it was so hidden. One of the things that I got the deepest into actually was this like old video game that I spent tons of time with in childhood that was originally for the Apple II, and then it was ported to MS-DOS, called Robot Odyssey. And it's kind of notorious for being like an extremely hard game. I think very few people have ever actually beat this game. I've never beaten it because I always get so distracted by taking it apart. And so I reverse engineered it very thoroughly so that I could actually build a port of it to Nintendo DS, because I was also interested in these portable game platforms. We didn't really have mobile gaming at the time, or this obviously would have been a mobile game. But it was relatively common that you could, buy one of these cheap flash cards off of China and then load your own games onto your DS. And usually these were pirated, but sometimes you could do homebrew games because we'd reverse engineered the hardware. So I wanted to make this thing that was kind of a reimagining, a port, very faithful to the original. But what I ended up finding when I really dove into the code was just this really deep appreciation for the art that goes into not just the game itself, not the interaction design or the visual design, but the code. And it was so much more easy to appreciate in this form factor because, this wasn't the era where just like one person could write a game. One person could even write an operating system in this era. And so by kind of picking apart the code, it was really great to get this appreciation for just how technology can be so personal. And it was kind of this thing that I felt was really lacking, something that, nobody really taught me. Nobody taught me that technology was about creating something personal and like imbuing an object with bits of yourself. People told me technology was, a way of solving problems. Computers are good at things. But this was one of those things that I had to discover on my own that really hooked me on this particular pursuit. So most of my work early on wasn't really art. I didn't really think of it as art, at least. It was, I thought of it as tech. It was learning tech. It was teaching myself. But I did occasionally, this was, I think, the first project I did that I did think of art at the time. This was a project I did in 2004 with one of my college roommates, actually. And he had just gotten interested in these chaotic maps from a math professor he liked. And I had thought about some interesting ways of rendering them using these kind of really real-time, interactive, high dynamic range histograms, where you could just plot this stream of millions of little points that were just kind of these pseudo-random outputs of a chaotic system, and then actually get a picture from them. So, really inspired by the way the human brain distills information by kind of filtering out layers of noise and looking at it from different scales. So we built this project in collaboration that used that visualization technique to really get inside these mathematical systems. And if you've ever seen Electric Sheep, actually, I didn't really know how Electric Sheep worked when I made this, but it turns out they use really similar algorithms, and they explore similar kind of sides of chaos. And I got really interested in chaos, this idea where, as I'm moving the mouse in this video, I'm kind of changing the parameters of this system. And there are areas where it kind of branches out into kind of infinite chaos, these like very, very detailed patterns that you just keep getting more and more detailed as you zoom in, like fractals. But there are other points where it just does something utterly boring. It collapses into a single point or a line. And I think so many systems in life are like this. It's another one of those visual analogies that I've been applying to just many areas of life. And I feel that so many of the most interesting points are that cusp of chaos, like when you're standing at the edge of a cliff and you know that jumping off would be boring because it would just be over so soon. And you know that like stepping away from the cliff, you wouldn't see anything. But on that very edge, you can see this beauty that's right on the edge of nothingness. And this project really helped me see that in chaos and get an appreciation for it. I never really just did software projects, though. I always had to kind of bounce back and forth between hardware and software. The problem with it wasn't that I would get bored. It was that I would actually just start to get like really depressed. Like if I only did hardware, if I only did software. There's something about this area kind of in between fields that really kind of keeps me going. And when I stray too far from that, I just completely lose my inspiration. So this project, I often pull it up as an example of a fairly nearly completely useless object that I built that I didn't really think of as art at the time, but really the only explanation for this object to exist is art at this point. And it's sitting on my bookshelf right now. It kind of looks like this weird toolbox full of markings. And what it does actually is it's a laser projector, and it can draw. This is about the best output it can do. It can, with a somewhat slow camera shutter speed, you can get entire cartoon characters. It's usually good at like single letters and like simpler cartoons. But inside, it kind of looks like this. It was the project of applying a bunch of artificial constraints. I forget who it was. Somebody really famous once, wrote a novel using, without the letter E, those kinds of constraints. I find that really pushes you to discover the boundaries of a medium. And I think this is actually what I was doing. I wasn't really thinking of it as art at the time, but what I was really doing is discovering the boundaries of using electronics as a medium. And to really use it as a medium, I couldn't buy the parts for a laser projector off of eBay and just assemble them because, all I would be doing is putting together a kit. So what I really found myself doing is taking parts and kind of hacking them and repurposing them. So in this case, I've got 2 pieces of hard disks chopped up with a hacksaw, and then some control electronics on the right. And the hard disks have actually been connected to these mirrors where they would usually be driving, disk actuator heads, moving the magnets, the magnetic read heads across a disk. And so, I did all this like weird stuff. My constraints were I wanted to use no application-specific parts. I wanted it to all be digital electronics. So I was kind of constraining my medium. I wanted to study what you could do with off-the-shelf parts and microcontrollers. So this is a medium that's actually familiar to a lot of people, but it isn't usually the medium you would use to build something like this. So it was an interesting experience and something that kind of after the fact started to seem a lot like art to me, but at the time was kind of one of those maddening engineering pursuits that I would just stay up till 3 a.m. for 4 months in a row and not really know why. When I wasn't staying up till 3 a.m. working on engineering, after graduating, my first job was kind of at VMware, where another thing that I didn't really consider art at the time, but in hindsight, it was really an interesting exploration of the medium of software and how you break software. I worked a lot on taking 3D graphics and USB, complicated peripherals like that, and getting them to run inside VMs. I wrote like the early GPU drivers for VMs and the USB and USB 3 emulation. And it was kind of like doing magic tricks all day. You would write software that would pretend to be hardware, but would have to do it really fast because there were customers that had to like just see the entire thing as software. And so you were constantly pulling these like digital rabbits out of hats. And because it was so complicated, it was another opportunity to really develop new tools. So this was a visualization tool there's actually a lot more to this, and you could like edit shaders in real time, and this is how we would debug video games running inside VMs, and so we got Portal running pretty quickly. But it was a really stifling environment there. I also learned that, to me, it's extremely creative, but you're not really expected to be doing creative work in an environment like that. To do it well requires just an enormous amount of creativity, but they're really just taking this creativity and kind of like using those paving stones or like grinding up your artwork and making cement out of it. So, and I was going through just so much in my life at the time. I moved to California. I like came out several times. One of my ways of kind of like sneaking out some artwork, kind of smuggling some artwork out of this like engineering mine, was to put an Easter egg in. So I have like a weird little nested Easter egg. So after that, I moved to San Francisco, did a lot of things completely differently, quit the big company, joined a startup. We made this weird little video game system. With Eyeo, it has these little blocks that have little microcontrollers, and it was all just like very slick. It was based on this MIT Media Lab project. The founders of the company had this prototype that was pretty great. It was like $400 a unit. And they brought me in kind of just at that point where they had a prototype that was pretty good, and they had a first generation product that was okay. And they wanted to just make like a really solid consumer product, but it was also, a video game, a toy, so it has to be like very budget conscious. And so they kind of hired me to do this, what turned out to be kind of an impossible project of just, using just loads of technology to kind of squeeze this video game console onto the tiniest possible microcontroller. Doing 60 frames a second graphics on something much less powerful than the Arduino with no graphics coprocessor. And then compressing video and sending it over 2.4 gigahertz radio. And so it was this project that I found, it really satisfied that part of me that really likes to get addicted to tech projects. And so I just kind of like went all in on that. And I did nothing but this for like about a year. And it kind of satisfied that urge in me. Like I needed to just kind of, it was sort of that myth of the competitive tech geek that pervades so much of software culture, where everybody just wants to like show that they're the best at tech because maybe this is making up for all the other things that they feel like they aren't the best at in life. And so that was one of the problems I had at VMware, is just this like extremely competitive culture. And so, maybe some of that rubbed off on me, and I wanted to just make the thing that was like the pinnacle of like all the tech I could do. And so I did that. Like I put all the tech I know how to build into this Eyeo thing. And it was technically really great, and I felt like it was just this really artistic creation. But it was more cement, more paving stones, and so I burned down on that, and I quit that job, and I decided to just try making art for a while. But I didn't really just tell myself I was going to make art, because there's this whole imposter syndrome thing around artists, and it took me a really long time to be comfortable with that word art. So I was really inspired by a friend of mine, actually, who quit her job in HR and just kind of like re-examined her life and then got started up again in computer science. So I figured I was just going to give myself some space and transition to another career. And I just found myself making things. So I started making generative art. This is kind of a Tetris L block made out of Tetris L blocks by a program that continuously randomly places them and keeps only the ones that make it look more like an L block. But it's an impossible goal because you can never make a perfect L block out of these little L blocks. So you kind of get to see all the ways that it kind of messes up. It reminds me a lot of life. And I really like exploring things that illuminate aspects of life. So I got really interested in just how people have an aesthetic. It's really weird that humans like certain shapes and not other shapes. It's kind of like Las Vegas. Las Vegas seems like space aliens landed, and we're like, what do humans like? We think they like lights here. We think they like machines with levers, and you can put money in them. Okay, and they seem to like booze and steakhouses. We'll just put those together. So it's like, well, I feel kind of like that sometimes, like an alien kind of examining humanity, because I kind of feel like I come from this weird place. So I was thinking of this project, well, what if you just gave people a way to put a dot down on a canvas, and then you aggregated those over time, and you see, how do people have an aesthetic? How do they choose what looks good? But I don't have a million people I can ask to put one dot down on a piece of canvas and then do a histogram. I do have a lot of photos. So I started downloading photos. I downloaded like 2 terabytes of photos by scraping Google Images. They were all the same resolution. I was trying to mostly just get like, quick snapshots from a cell phone, things where people made a little bit of a decision for framing, but not masterpieces. And then I started overlaying them. I did this really, very high bit depth, long exposure with all these images, and then just started pulling out different kind of frequency bands in these images and like looking for patterns. And I started to see bizarre stuff like this. And I don't know about you, but I see like skulls and faces and like, weird kind of hallways and whatever in this image. And I think it's a great testament to all the information that humans kind of unintentionally absorb and also create. And so I found myself really fascinated with that. And just with using algorithms for art. And I started doing this non-technically also. So this is not digital. This is just paper and pen. But I was kind of exploring, well, how does this work if I just kind of let my fingers wander into different algorithms? And I started making different shapes, thinking about the structure of like how drawing actually works. And so I'd like to take some of this into a more digital realm too. And then I started making things that turned out to be really popular on the internet. Like I reverse engineered this wireless protocol for a vibrator and built this remote control that uses a sonar distance sensor. And so like this was also another project that I didn't really think of as art at the time, but I think it's totally art. Like it's something that it accompanied this article that, like, in very detailed instructions, tells you how to build one of these. Has also all the source code is open. It uses Arduino. And it really seemed to be a way of starting a social dialogue, saying, to women, like, this tech isn't, it doesn't just belong to the manufacturers. It doesn't just belong to the guys. Like, you can take control over this yourself, too. And that's a dialogue that I continue to be interested in. So, I did a bunch of random stuff after quitting at Siftio. I found that LEDs actually have been kind of this theme in my life for a long time. I've liked LEDs, ever since I first started electronics, because they were just like such an immediate way of seeing what you're doing, especially as a visual learner. I tried building some things out of LEDs. I got really fascinated by high dynamic range displays. I saw one of these at SIGGRAPH in like 2004, and this was an LCD display with an LED matrix behind it, all built into one enclosure. So you could get very, very bright and very dark colors in the same display. I thought that was fascinating. And so I bought a bunch of parts and then, built some things, and some time passes and I built some more things, and then I repurposed some parts. And I still built some LED matrices out of this. Back then, LED matrices were a lot harder to build. So, we still had to use ultraviolet light to erase our microcontrollers before programming, and, we couldn't just have like an Arduino. So some time passes, and then I start looking into LEDs again, after kind of getting more into art lately. And a lot has changed. So, instead of having these like $10 blue LEDs, now we have these 15-cent LEDs with built-in microcontrollers, basically. You just give them serial data, and they have a current source, so the brightness is controlled, and they do all this stuff automatically. So you can just give them serial data, and they light up a color. So this was a really interesting enabling technology. And, I started thinking about what you can do with this. Well, a lot of people are already doing things with these new LEDs. You see these all over the place. This was actually in Times Square. I was visiting New York, and there was some kind of sports ball thing happening. I think it was Super Bowl related, and they were constructing what appeared to me to be just a giant American flag made of LEDs, which seemed to be very fitting for Times Square. A lot of people see these LEDs, and they see that you can use them to make images, and then it's like, Jumbotron. You want to scale it up. And so people all the time see these LEDs, and they ask me, oh, that's great. Can you make it bigger? Can we just have like an entire room full of them? And sometimes that makes sense. There's certainly something to scale in art. But there's also this tendency with LEDs. It's just really easy to want more of them. And it starts to become in some ways kind of a different kind of addiction. In some ways, kind of a way of showing wealth. People who have a lot of money, whether it's, people in Times Square or, Las Vegas or, parts of the Burning Man community, they just they have all this money, they just want to turn it into LEDs. And it's really easy to do because, people will sell you them, it turns out. But so sometimes with scale, it's really neat. You can have all these origami paper objects all over the room, and it's just magnificent because of its simplicity. But you have that many LEDs, and it's like, oh yeah, okay, so you paid for this, great. And I wanted to know what else you can do with LEDs besides just impress people and distract people and use them for advertising and messages. I wanted to really just explore them as a medium. So I started really wanting to do something that was more about the opposite of the LED. An LED is a point of light. It's very digital. I wanted something that was tangible, a physical object, a very kind of solid polygon, and then something with character to it, something that wasn't representational. I think LEDs really bore me when they're trying to be televisions, but when they're trying to be abstract art, I think they're pretty interesting. So this was a project which I started pretty early, and it kind of came to fruition much later as I was using the hardware as a prototype for a lot of things. But I think this really illustrates the way that LEDs can have an abstract art character to them. So this is just 16 LEDs behind these kind of separate little triangles that are all, I intended to make them kind of as uniform as possible. And I really didn't want them to have that kind of characteristic kind of flicker and stair step and kind of on and off that you see with LEDs. I wanted them to be just kind of warm and glowing and have more of a kind of character animation feel to it. And so this is actually a particle system where there are bundles of particles that kind of spawn from some point, in the vicinity of this triangle, and then they're attracted to these kind of gravitational poles at each corner of the triangle, and they kind of sweep through in a chaotic path. Every time it fades in, a bundle of particles starts. There's this sort of new universe. It moves in this chaotic path. Depending on how interesting it is, the universe might last more or less time, and then it fades out. And so, this project was really the first time I tried just getting all of those qualities into LEDs, and it required a lot of work. One thing I discovered was color. People use they pick out RGB colors, HSV colors. People do this a lot in generative art. And if you're focusing more on form, maybe that isn't as noticeable. But when LEDs are really about just being this physical vessel for light and color, color is really important. And humans are not just sensitive to the color, but the spatial relationships between colors. What colors appear in proximity near each other and in time. So, I thought I'd take a page out of the book of electronic musicians and cheat and sample. So I've been sampling colors from photographs a lot. And so that triangle actually, the particles all sample colors from this photograph. And it kind of has this desert environment. It's taken the high desert test sites. And that's my friend Nicole. And so some of the particles actually remind me of her. But to reproduce colors accurately, you kind of have to understand a bit more of the perception of light and how that interacts with these LEDs. So humans have this very nonlinear perception of light. The LEDs, when you tell them to be at halfway in their brightness scale, they'll put out about half as much power. Some of them have some nonlinearity, but it's usually roughly linear. Whereas humans, it's you go up a little bit in brightness, and all of a sudden the difference between nothing and a candle light is just immense. The difference between a candle and two candles is a lot less. And then when you're up into the daylight, you need a lot of light just to be visible in the day. And so you can correct for this with gamma correction, which we've been doing with monitors forever. But the problem is, because you're doing this in software on top of this thing that's already in hardware, got this 8-bit linear scale, if you do the correction and you zoom in, actually, it quantizes really badly. And so you don't really have a lot of resolution in the color, especially when you get down to this low brightness range. So when I was working on the triangle, I stumbled on this method for kind of working around this problem a little bit. So it's a little bit like old school graphical dithering, except this time you replace the x-axis with time. And if you want a color that's kind of partway in between, you can actually kind of flash on and off. But actually it isn't really flashing that much. It's oscillating between two really nearby pulse width modulation levels. So it's kind of like another level of modulation on top of what the LED is already doing. And it looks kind of like this. So on the left, there's no dithering. The LEDs are just trying to approximate kind of a gradient pattern, but you see some of them are off. Some of them are actually just the wrong color, because maybe one of the color primaries is, it's down to either being off or on, and the other color primaries have more resolution. But with the dithering, it's, you see some flickering, which has a different artistic effect. I actually kind of like it sometimes because it kind of distracts the eye from hard edges that might otherwise be there. So it kind of gives you a kind of an accurate idea of how much uncertainty the image has, which I like. But usually it's not even visible. Like some of those LEDs, you see the colors are very smooth, even though you aren't seeing the flickering that's still happening. The other challenge I ran into when exploring LEDs as a medium by building this triangle was to just have the LED light spread out very evenly, because I wanted these to be just like perfect little triangles. So I built kind of a construction kit for myself, kind of like a little Lego kit made of laser cut pieces, and assembled them in different ways and tried to figure out what worked well. And this actually works really well. If you just have like, this is actually not fully assembled. The whole thing is maybe an inch thick or so, but just like a box that the light can bounce around in. If it's just as concave as possible and light has enough opportunity to bounce around, it'll mix really well, and then it'll appear uniform on the top. So I tried other reflector styles, because that one was obviously a lot of work with all the laser cutting. I wanted to do something that was maybe vacuum formable so I could do more scale. So I experimented with other shapes. That one didn't work very well. So I had this idea that I wanted to write like an optimizer. I wanted to like ray trace how the light would behave in these boxes where the LEDs were, and then I wanted to just write this really simple program that would optimize the path of that I was doing the vacuum forming along to get the best uniformity. And so I get so distracted playing with this like little ray tracing toy that I make in like open frameworks or whatever, that I'm just like, oh man, this experience of kind of like sculpting the actual user interaction of kind of manipulating light like this is actually really fun and satisfying. And I want to make this more accessible. So this kind of turned into another side project where I implemented that in HTML5 with ASM.js and web workers and all this, and now there's this website zenphoton.com where it's just like a little garden where you can tend your photons and kind of sculpt them into different shapes. And this taught me something also that I've been trying to incorporate into other art projects that I really like. So there's feedback loops, right? In this case, it's really about creating a feedback loop between the participant and the medium. And then that feedback loop, as a byproduct, generates an artwork. But the thing I'm really interested in is the feedback loop. And it has all these unintended consequences. So when you're working with something like this, you kind of sort of know how the light behaves, but a lot of times it surprises you, and you get these reflections you didn't really anticipate, or you start drawing a line, and then you have to kind of adjust it because it doesn't quite line up, and then you see another possibility show up. And the unintended consequences let you chase your own mistakes down paths you wouldn't have otherwise discovered. So in that vein, I decided to chase one of my other paths, mistakes. That led to going even farther down this path and making an offline render that uses an Amazon EC2 cluster to do animation. And so here, all you're seeing is a sine wave made of kind of light reflective pieces, and then everything else is just the caustics. And normally that would just be weird shapes on a swimming pool. But by taking a slice through that and like eliminating one dimension, it became much more visible what these are doing. And then you can start simplifying it even more and turning down the number of light rays. And by kind of carefully keeping the random number generator stable, you can see the life of each light ray and then how the light rays combine to create these shapes. So I found light really fascinating. This is just, kind of another abstract, L system. What happens if you just start bouncing light off of the most abstract tree possible? And it would simulate color by actually having light sources with kind of a spectral distribution for them. So some of the lines, when you turn down the number of rays, you kind of almost get this colored pencil look as you see the different kind of spectral components overlapping with each other. So I had a lot of fun with light and generative art. One problem I had with this, though, is it was all still on the computer, which means I get unsatisfied and depressed and want to do something with my hands. So this weird opportunity came along to make a cloud on a forklift with some people and take it to a desert. And that actually seemed like a great way to get back to making things with my hands. And it was also a great motivation to kind of scale up my LED work, because this was much bigger than anything I'd made so far. And so it was this ridiculous thing, went 40 feet up in the air. This is it actually raining on a parade. And it was kind of a ridiculous project because we actually literally took it from like stick figure drawings, actual stick figure drawings, to a thing in the desert that people could like hang from safely and do aerials and with light in like 2 months. So we built this thing in our shop out of a whole bunch of plastic HDPE, which I actually wouldn't recommend for LEDs because it has a weird spectral thing going on, makes it look red, but and a bunch of LEDs. And this is where I started really thinking about, how to make LEDs scale. I'd been kind of really just enamored by how smooth the light was in that triangle, and I kind of couldn't turn back now. I couldn't settle for the light that wasn't that smooth, so I needed to figure out how to make that scale. So that was when I started experimenting with this and ended up developing the same techniques I had earlier into a controller that could handle a project like this. This was like 2,500 LEDs. And because these weren't actually fully installed, they're just kind of draped in there to see how it would look. But that's actually a personnel platform where 5 people can stand. So there isn't really any room for projections, and it has to be fairly bright. So LEDs were really the only option for this, but we wanted it to look very smooth and natural. So we took it out to the desert, and it wasn't really like anything people had seen because it was very smooth and volumetric. It wasn't kind of blinky and in your face. And we did this with a Raspberry Pi and a bunch of power supplies, and we had a Touch OSC interface, which was actually one of the most fun parts because then you can just like give kids this thing and then they can control it. And giving kids the controls to a project is the best thing. We got to do this recently, taking it to an art opening, I guess a few weeks ago now in Oakland. So you can see the animations now. It's not a display device. People think of these digital things and they want a screen, something you can run programs on, but that's not what we wanted. We just wanted it to be a cloud. And it happens to have some lighting. It happens to be a digital cloud, but this is what a digital cloud does. You have controls like wind speed and direction. But it doesn't really strive to do things that are uncloud-like. So it's having that bit of restraint in the lighting design has actually been really good for us aesthetically in creating an object that people can just kind of identify with. So after building the cloud, I was actually pretty stoked to get the technology into more people's hands. Because after seeing like what happens when I make an LED thing, I built this fade candy thing. It has these algorithms for kind of doing the dithering and all that built in. It controls 512 LEDs. We made easy instructions and teamed up with Adafruit to assemble them on their really awesome pick-and-place machine. And then after getting all this infrastructure, I finally got to go back and see, well, what can we do with the LEDs that actually feels worthwhile? What is the thing that sets it apart from being a screen? So really, they're really emotional. They really interact with their environment. This was a light instrument I made in collaboration with my friend Serene, and it's actually just using the MIDI data from her piano performance to drive the LEDs in this way where the keys, some of them set off particles and some of them kind of cause chaotic interactions with those particles. And it's hard to capture in video, but the way it interacts with the environment and just kind of sets off some visceral part in our brain that responds to light is really engaging. I did this in a different form with kind of some more of advanced visuals in this project that is actually kind of a game that allows people to kind of live remix music. And so as you kind of poke these buttons, you get this very visceral feedback where not only does the music change immediately, but you get this light that flashes on the beat, and actually the light changes depending on kind of the mood of the song and where you are in the song, and it's another memory cue. It kind of makes the game more synesthetic and tightens that feedback loop. So then more recently, I finally got an opportunity to do an installation with LEDs that was just kind of what I would do if I had just kind of a larger amount of space to work with and an ability to do kind of more of a permanent install. So this is a piece I just finished, Ecstatic Epiphany, which I wanted. So the opportunity was a window, 4 by 8 feet, in the sidewalk, in the Tenderloin in San Francisco. Kind of an interesting social experiment because it's this block of the city that's nobody really wants to be in. It's full of some kind of boarded up convenience stores, people selling on the street, and it's not really a place that is really that engaging. So the city has been trying to bring in more artists into the area and just trying to liven it up. So this was actually in collaboration with an arts organization, Counterpulse, who's moving into that building. And I built this thing behind the glass wall that's actually made up of these laser cut mat board boxes that kind of give you this display that's it's very much not like pixels in some way. It's very smooth. It really deals with these analog interactions between the kind of gradients in the boxes and the light. But then it does kind of like call back to pixels because you do have these boxes and it occupies space in a window. So we made it out of these laser cut pieces. It had to fit in this very cramped space behind a in a stairwell. It ran off of this small embedded Linux machine. And interactivity, everybody wants these things to be interactive, but I wasn't really sure what interactivity would fit this particular piece. So I thought of it actually as kind of a portal into another world, like there was something behind this window that you can't quite get to, but you can kind of investigate and interact with and move with. So I wanted something actually that would like follow you as you were walking across the sidewalk. It would kind of catch you and notice you, and then start moving with you, and you would get this sense of perspective shift. So it would actually be an extension of the interactivity that you already get without any software, where you place something behind the glass and you have this kind of parallax effect that catches your eye out of the corner as you move by. So I wanted to exaggerate that with software and kind of allow that to also shape how the algorithms behind the piece evolved. So that led me to look at sensors. Ended up using this cheap security camera. Connect wouldn't have been really feasible out there. And then using this sparse optical flow tracking, you can see it there tracking the aerial silks and getting an idea of just one vector, how it's moving back and forth. And I think really in interactivity, I don't really see it as being about the quantity of the data, but really just the tightness of the control loop. In this case, it's just one vector, but it's reliable and it's very low latency. And that means you get this very intimate connection with the piece. You can see that it's responding to you, not just kind of, sort of, but it's definitely responding to you. And it kind of triggers that part of our brain that detects correspondences. The other inspiration I had in this, I really like simple systems in nature that produce complex patterns. This is actually video feedback. All this is a video camera and an LCD. And they produce these amazing patterns. All it takes is feedback and nonlinearity. So I wanted to try exploring that to create a narrative. So kind of in the tradition of abstract expressionist art, I wanted to kind of express a sequence of emotions by using a combination of algorithms, sampled colors from photos. And so this is what I came up with. It transitions smoothly. It cycles over the course of about 20 minutes. It's never the same. It's interactive. A lot of the scenes kind of diverge a little bit depending on how you interact with them. But they always have the same character. And to me, it started out representing this cycle of kind of self-referential creativity. How do you go through this process and inspire people? But then it kind of turned into this something that to me felt much more about, how do you do this without feeling isolated? How do you combat depression? How do you feel rejuvenated? And how do you recycle this process? So that's kind of what I think about LEDs. That's what I would build if I had some LEDs. But a lot of people like these things, and they get super excited, and they just want to do everything with LEDs and just put Comic Sans on them. And it's hard to tell why people like them, but I have some theories. So I think they're really abstract. They kind of force you to not be representational. You can make something that's just a bunch of colors and shapes with LEDs, and people don't kind of squint and go like, oh, I don't see what it's supposed to be. They just kind of feel it, which is what you wanted them to do anyway. And it gives you this opportunity to imbue situations with more emotion. And they're interactive. Even if you don't have technology behind it, they change how you see objects and see the world. And then they require you to construct physical objects, to fabricate things, and then they give you an emotional payoff. They tell you very viscerally just how a signal looks, and it's like an optical subwoofer. So they're also right in the middle of this kind of weird art and tech thing that we have going. A lot of people talk about art and tech, but I think it's really kind of more like this. And I think LEDs are actually at a really interesting spot, kind of along some of these inner contours. And they I mentioned these generative algorithms. There's so much math behind that. There's all this science of perception of the algorithms, how they relate to the universe, how all of this stuff fits together. And I feel like this is an opportunity we have. If this is something people like anyway, if it's something that's engaging, let's use this to educate people in a way that doesn't force them down one path or the other. Let's not give people a math class. Let's not give people, a computer class or an art class. Let's just give them a creativity class and just give them some of these tools that give you branching out points, and then give kids resources to follow all those different directions and see what they do. So I want this to go down to all levels. I want this to go down to grade school when it can. Right now, it's seeing some start in teaching other like artists, educators. But this needs to just keep getting easier to use and keep getting easier to teach, and then we can start using it more. So thank you.